If you listen to the headlines, one thing sounds obvious. Almost every nation on Earth is deep in debt. The United States, Europe, Japan. Even oil-rich and export-heavy countries like Saudi Arabia, Germany, and China. But hidden inside that obvious fact is a question almost nobody really answers. If all these governments owe money, who is on the other side of the deal? If all nations are in debt, who is holding all the IOUs? That's the mystery we're about to unravel. We usually talk about debt as if it's just a burden, something countries should get rid of when times are good and struggle with when times are bad. But in the modern world, debt is more than a weight. It's the skeleton holding everything together. Every war, every bailout, every crisis, and every boom sits on top of layers of IOUs, quietly linking governments, banks, companies, and households. And if you follow those IOUs far enough, across borders, across institutions, you reach a strange conclusion. The world doesn't really owe money to one single master, in a way. It owes money to itself, but the gains and the pain are not shared equally. To understand how we got here, we have to rewind to a time before credit cards and trading screens. In early modern Europe, wars were long and brutal. Kings needed ships, cannons, and soldiers now. But their treasuries ran out of gold, so they turned to merchants and bankers. In England in the late 1600s, the crown offered a new kind of deal. Give us money today, and we'll repay you tomorrow with a steady stream of interest, funded by future taxes. To manage this promise, the Bank of England was created. For the first time, the state could spend money it didn't yet have, and lenders received something priceless, a tradable promise from the government, the first true government bonds. Once the idea of government bonds existed, other nations rushed to copy it. France adapted the model, the Dutch refined it, the young United States leaned on it to fund its revolution and expansion. Slowly, the meaning of national debt changed. It stopped being a symbol of failure and became a badge of credibility. The question was no longer, does this country have gold? It was, can this country borrow reliably and pay interest on time? The ability to issue debt at low cost became a form of power. Empires no longer needed to march across continents for treasure. They could sell their promises to the world instead. The battlefield shifted from land and cannons to interest rates and balance sheets. Fast forward 3 centuries, and debt is no longer an exception. It's the default system of the planet. Every major government issues its own IOUs, bonds, bills, notes. Banks, insurance companies, and investment funds buy them. Pension funds and savings plans hold them for ordinary people who often don't even realize they own government debt. Global borrowing keeps climbing. By trillions of dollars at a time, every country owes. Every bank lends, and almost every citizen, through taxes and savings, is both a debtor and a creditor in the same machine. We live on a planet built on IOUs, but we still haven't answered the core question in this giant network: who actually holds the other end of the rope? To make this concrete, let's zoom in on one country, the United States. From the outside, U.S. government debt looks like one enormous number, a mountain of trillions. But that mountain is made of many different claims. Roughly half of it sits inside the government itself, money that one arm of the state owes to another. The other half is held by investors. And here's the important part. About 2/3 of those investors are American. U.S. banks that park their money in treasuries, insurance companies matching long-term policies, mutual funds and pension funds managing retirement, savings, and above them, the Federal Reserve, which has bought large amounts of government bonds over time. The remaining slice, about 1/3 of the publicly held debt, belongs to foreign holders. Countries like Japan, China, the UK, and a long list of others. So when people say, America is in debt to China, there's a grain of truth, but it's only a small fraction of the whole picture. Most of the time, a nation's debt is held mainly by its own system. It owes money, not just to foreigners, but to its own banks, funds, and citizens. Now zoom back out to the world. Japan buys U.S. treasuries. The United States backs the IMF. European countries fund the World Bank. Developing nations borrow from all of them, then take the dollars and euros they earn and park their reserves back into safe Western bonds. Country A holds the IOUs of Country B. Country B guarantees loans to Country C. Country C holds the bonds of Country A. It becomes a global loop. It's like a game of hot potato, except the potato is made of promises, or a poker table, where every player has borrowed their chips from the next person. There's no single world creditor sitting above everyone else. There's a tangled web where almost everyone holds someone else's IOU, and the whole thing stays standing only as long as confidence does. Behind this web of promises stands another layer of power. Pension funds that manage millions of retirements, insurance companies that must invest for decades, hedge funds and asset managers chasing yield, sovereign wealth funds investing the surpluses of oil, states and export giants. Together, these institutions control tens of trillions of dollars. They decide, in practice, which countries borrow cheaply and which pay painfully high interest just to roll over their debt. When they trust a government, funding flows and crises stay quiet. When they lose trust, borrowing costs spike, currencies wobble, and governments can be pushed to the edge almost overnight. Elections may decide who sits in office, but these invisible judges, the markets and mega investors, often decide who gets to survive financially. Above even the markets stand the central banks. They don't just watch the debt system, they actively shape it. When a central bank like the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank buys government bonds, it pays with money it has just created. One balance sheet's liability becomes another balance sheet's asset. In our world, almost every unit of money is mirrored by somebody's debt. Central banks are the high priests of that arrangement. They keep the cycle of IOUs and money creation alive, and as long as people trust them, the whole structure keeps standing. So after all of this, what's the real answer? There's no single world creditor sitting above everyone else. The world's debt is owned by a messy mix of domestic banks, pension funds, foreign governments, giant investors, and ordinary savers like you. In that sense, we do owe it to ourselves, but not equally. Interest flows upward, from taxpayers and workers to those who hold the IOUs. That's why debt and inequality rise together. So the real question isn't just who holds the IOUs, it's where you stand inside this system. If this changed how you see the numbers behind the headlines, hit subscribe. Here on Minted Histories, we use the past to decode the money shaping your future.